In this video, we'll talk about the diencephalon. Now, the diencephalon is made up of four major components, and that is the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, and the subthalamus. Now, as I said, it's really located at the physical center of the brain, and certainly look at diagrams and you'll see what I'm talking about in terms of its location. And these four components each have its own group of nuclei and that receive specific input and also send output to other regions of the brain. And really the diencephalon is about information coming in and being sent out to the right place. That's one of the major things that happens. Plus there's a whole number of other sort of in-house tasks that occur, and we'll see them as we go through this. So if we look at the thalamus itself, it's the main entry route for sensory data entering the cerebral cortex. So really information coming from the peripheral nervous system, entering the spinal cord, heading up to the brain, passes through the thalamus, and often here is where it gets sorted out and redirected to where it's supposed to go. So let's describe it, the shape of it. It's two egg-shaped regions of gray matter. It makes up actually about 80% of the diencephalon if we look at the mass. Because remember, the diencephalon are four things altogether. So the thalamus actually makes up a good bulk of it. And if you're sort of trying to landmark where it is, once you know the ventricles, the third ventricle is located between the two regions. Because remember, the thalamus is made up of two different parts. It's bilateral. And the thalamus, or the thalamic nuclei, if I want to say, receives afferent fibers from a whole number of regions of the nervous system. Now, there is one area it doesn't receive information from, and that's the sense of smell, because that goes elsewhere. And we can have a look here just to give ourselves sort of the general orientation of where we are and what we're looking at. That here is a front view. So in a front view, you can see very deep inside there is the thalamus and the diencephalon. Now here's the thalamus, and you can see that there are two parts, and there is a connection between them. Now the epithalamus we can see here in this diagram. The hypothalamus, hypo for below, is located here, and then we have the subthalamic region down here, and we're entering the brainstem at this point. So here's another view. You can see this is looking down because there's anterior, there's posterior, and you can see the two parts of the thalamus right there. You can see a bit of the pineal gland, which we'll talk about, and a third ventricle running between the two thalami here. And you can see some of the epithalamus. So what does the thalamus do? It helps to really control cortical activity by directing information from lower levels to the cerebral cortex. So it controls which input should go on to the cerebral cortex for processing. And each half of the thalamus has three main groups of nuclei. There are a lot of separate nuclei that are crammed within the thalamus, and at this level we're not going to go into all of them. There's quite a few of them, and each takes on its own list of functions. So we have all these three main groups of nuclei that are separated by thin layers of white matter within the thalamus. And all these specific nuclei, what do? They act as relay stations. So they receive input, they integrate information, and send the information out to specific either motor or sensory areas in the cerebral cortex. So this really highlights the importance of the thalamus in taking information in, processing it, selecting which goes on to higher level processing and action. So the thalamus also has association nuclei, which receive information from a number of sources. And some of the things that these nuclei are involved with is that they're related to processing information about things such as memory and emotions, and also it helps to integrate sensory information at this level. Now, processed information is sent to appropriate association areas in the cerebral cortex. So this is almost like a pre-sorting, the initial analysis of the information, and then the information gets sent to higher levels in the cerebral cortex, where those association areas that the information is being sent to can do further processing and evaluation and possibly acting on the information. There's also non-specific nuclei, and these receive information from the basal nuclei, the cerebellum, and the motor cortex. And as you go through this chapter, you'll realize that all three of these do have their hand in motor activity and motion. And we'll come back and talk about, we have talked a bit about the basal nuclei, but it'll come up again throughout the course. And the cerebellum has a role, of course, in terms of some of the issues when it comes to planning motion, making motion happening in the right timing, etc. Now, the non-specific nuclei can send information to a wide range of locations like the cerebral cortex or other brain regions. And also the non-specific nuclei have roles in things like controlling arousal, consciousness, level of responsiveness, and excitability of the cerebral cortex. Now, there's also a group of nuclei, the anterior and inferior, that what they do is they have a number of vital functions that we need in terms of survival. And they help to regulate things such as the sleep-wake cycle, thirst, hunger, body temperature, and the autonomic nervous system. So you're starting to get a sense that we're starting to look at the whole diencephalon. The thalamus has a lot of stuff. The hypothalamus, which we're on right now, has a lot of stuff too. And we'll be talking about coming back to the hypothalamus when we start talking about the endocrine system, because associated with the hypothalamus is the pituitary, the anterior and posterior pituitary. And a lot of hormones come from the pituitary glands. Now, the hypothalamus is not surprisingly, its location is below the thalamus itself. And there is, as I said, the pituitary gland is connected to it. And what we have is a little stalk that anatomically and functionally connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. And this little stalk we call the infundibulum. And we'll see that once we get down to the pituitary gland, it's actually a combination of endocrine and nervous tissue, but we'll come back to that. So what's the job of the hypothalamus when it comes to, say, the endocrine system? Well, once again, when we get to endocrinology, we'll see what happens, but the basic game plan is that the hypothalamus makes a number of hormones. Now, these hormones, most of them are targeted at the pituitary, which is right below it. So I'm just going to draw a little schematic here that this is the hypothalamus up here. There is that stalk, the stalk, which is the infundibulum, and then we have the pituitary. So I'm going to make it a different color. So we have the pituitary gland down here. Now the pituitary has two parts to it, okay? And part of it is actually nervous tissue, and part of it is actually true endocrine tissue. So what's the role of the hypothalamus? Well, the hypothalamus makes a number of releasing or inhibiting hormones that can travel down to the pituitary to control whether the pituitary will release or not release hormones. So that's one of the big jobs of the hypothalamus. Now, given that, you would realize that since the hypothalamus has so much control over the pituitary, one of the major endocrine glands in the body, that the hypothalamus would receive input from a number of regions of the body, and it does. So, the hypothalamus, as I said, secretes release and inhibiting hormones, and they affect the pituitary. And the pituitary gland secretes hormones that affect activities of other endocrine glands throughout the body. And we'll see that certainly the pituitary is one of the big endocrine control centers in the body. So also look at the hypothalamus, because there are two parts. One of the parts is, as I said, is true, not the hypothalamus, but the hypothalamus and its relationship to the pituitary. Part of the pituitary is endocrine and part of it is nervous tissue. Now, there are a couple hormones, such as antidiuretic hormone, that affect water balance, and oxytocin, which have a role in uterine contractions during birth. And these are interesting. These are hypothalamic hormones that do not affect the pituitary gland itself, and because these are associated with the posterior pituitary. But that'll make more sense when we get to endocrinology. Now, as I said, the hypothalamus, because it's so important in controlling the role of the anterior and posterior pituitary and its functioning, it receives a lot of input from many sources of the body, and that includes the cortex and even the basal nuclei. Okay, when we're looking at the hypothalamus, associated with it are these things called the mammillary bodies. And this connects the hypothalamus to the limbic system. So you receive input from the hippocampus, memory, regulation, behavior. Input from outside the nervous system. The endocrine system also provides information from any of its detectors or receptors out there that will detect changes like body temperature or changes in osmolarity of the blood and things like that. The epithalamus, okay, epi, above, on top, is superior to the thalamus. And most of that is made up by the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is associated with the endocrine system. And it secretes melatonin, which has a role in sleep-wake cycle. And then there's the subthalamus, and it is functionally connected to the basal nuclei. Now remember, whenever we think about basal nuclei, one of their big jobs has to do with planning motor activity. How is the motor activity going to occur? So not surprisingly, if the subthalamic region is connected to the basal nuclei, it has a role in controlling movement. And here's just sort of an overall view of it, and we can see that everything we've talked about is very deep, really central to the brain. And you can see that, there's the thalamus, which is bilateral. There's the hypothalamus. There's the pituitary coming off of it. So let's have a look at that here. So here's the thalamus. Now we can't see the other thalamus, which is hidden in behind here, because remember, it's bilateral. We have the hypothalamus area right here. And here is the pituitary gland, which is associated functionally and structurally with the hypothalamus. Now, this is largely endocrine. The anterior aspect is true endocrine tissue, and we're going to see in the endocrine chapter, this is actually nervous tissue. But just to come back to what we're talking about, the hypothalamus does make a number of releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones that travel down here and affect the action of the pituitary. The mammillary body, which we talked about, is located there. The subthalamus here. You can see a bit of the epithalamus and part of the pineal gland here. And of course, once we get below this level, we're in the classic parts of the brain stem. Okay, we're going to end it there, and next video we'll come back and talk about the cerebellum.